All right. So, hello, and welcome to this talk, The Absent, Omnipresent Women of Hitchcock by Rebecca McCallum. Thank you so much for being here. Let me introduce Rebecca a little bit. So Rebecca McCallum is a writer, speaker, and creator and host of Talking Hitchcock, a podcast that explores the work and the world of her favorite director. The podcast covers deep dives on Hitchcock's films, as well as topic-driven discussions on everything in the Hitchcockian universe. She has written about Hitchcock's films both online and in print for many publications, including Fangoria, Graham Journal, Hemlock Books, and Movie John. She has spoken at Hitchcock, the biggest international Hitchcock conference of its kind, and co-hosted a program on BBC Radio. She also curates and hosts Hitchcock screenings, festivals, and events up and down the UK. All right, off to you.
Thank you, Ellie. And I'm so thrilled to be kicking off this weekend's festival talking about my favourite subject, Hitchcock, and specifically looking at these absent, omnipresent women, a subject that I've been thinking about for a really long time now. So I'm really excited to be able to share my thoughts with you all today. When it comes to Hitchcock women, there is so much to say and so much to discuss. So I'm really just going to get going straight away. And the three landmark films that I'll be exploring today, which came at really pivotal moments in Hitchcock's career, are Rebecca, Vertigo, and Psycho. And in order to discuss this topic in any detail, I will be spoiling all three of these films. So just a kind of advance warning before we move on. So without further ado, let's meet some incredible Hitchcock women, beginning with Rebecca. So Je Reviens is the name of Rebecca's boat, a detail of du Maurier's novel that we do not hear of in the film actually, and its translation from French to English is to come back. What I think then is a perfect way to describe what has taken place in Rebecca, a film where, as we will see in Vertigo and also in Psycho, the past and the present are always in dialogue with one another. And I just thought we'd start with a brief summary to get us started of Rebecca, just to refresh our memories. So, Rebecca follows a young and unnamed companion who meets and marries a moody and affluent Maxim de Winter. And while she makes every effort to ingratiate herself into this new life, she also finds herself battling for acceptance and identity, surrounded by reminders of Maxim's now deceased first wife, the titular Rebecca. And so, in this curiously mystical way of life mirroring art back and forth, Rebecca acts as a property that contains many examples of what we might deem absent, but also very visible and very integral women. Not least of all, of course, the celebrated author Daphne du Maurier, who penned the original novel. So, as the creator of Rebecca, which is here being adapted by Hitchcock, she actually shares some of that ghostly status of her eponymous character. But there's also the really invaluable contributions and the continued input of Hitchcock's wife, the here uncredited Alma Reville, as well as the remarkably gifted artist Dorothy Holt, who painted the backdrops. Her designs and her artistry inform not just how we receive, but how we remember Rebecca. And finally, and a little more amusingly, Irene Selznick, wife to the film's producer David O. Selznick, supplies Rebecca's handwriting. And it's handwriting that becomes so integral to the impact on the second Mrs. De Winter, manifesting itself as another form of coming back or returning. And her elegantly composed letters continue to reappear throughout the film. She too then becomes an invisible but yet pervasive female presence in this film. So, what do we know of Rebecca? She was married to Maxim de Winter. She was beautiful and a very successful society hostess at the grand home of Manderley. She was also sexually free, untamable, and erotic, with her housekeeper Mrs. Danvers noting on one occasion how her mistress was most particular about sauces. Rebecca was an unpredictable woman, threatening to emasculate her husband, rejecting her position in the traditional feminine domestic space. As Professor Tanya Bedleski has remarked in an interview on Expanding Hitchcock, she is someone who acts on her own sexuality, who laughs at the patriarchy. And I don't know about you, but I find that glorious. A natural starting point for understanding the power asserted by Rebecca is in the name of the film itself and of its absent heroine. Yes, I said heroine. Rebecca not only takes possession of the second Mrs. De Winter, but she stakes her claim over the film itself through its title, appearing even before the opening credits have ended. As her name fills the screen in grand, unignorable, and romantic letters, the name seems to come out of a foggy mist, telegraphing Madeline's emergence from the bathroom in 1958's Vertigo. There is an enigma, but also a strength, an undeniability to the way that she commands our immediate attention. It is as though she's telling us right away, do not forget me, here I am. And it's true throughout Rebecca and within the bookends of the film, which, through its looming title and in being etched onto a pillowcase, opens and closes with a forceful letter R. Rebecca will continue to return. But while Joan Fontaine remains nameless, she's also, of course, simultaneously Mrs. De Winter, resulting in then both a separation of the self and a merging of identities. The film rotates then on two female characters, one who is present and visible, but yet struggling to be seen, and the other who we cannot see, but who is felt in each and every frame. A non-corporeal form, Rebecca becomes reincarnated as the elements, most particularly through water, linking her to depth and transformation, whether it be the sexuality that we sense in the power of crashing waves, or the seductiveness in the glimmering reflections that dance on the walls of Manderley. Rebecca is a life force. She is eternal and fluid. The sudden rain that pours down upon the newlyweds as they arrive at Manderley is a shower that is charged with erotic symbolism, evoking an open-mouthed orgasmic gasp from the second Mrs. De Winter. Furthermore, Rebecca's private quarters of the West Wing look out onto the sea, a constant reminder that we are in a female space. We are in Rebecca's space. Inside Manderley, the camera floats and glides, and while this drifting effect places us in the eyes of the second Mrs. De Winter as she walks through its mazes and passages, it also places us in the perspective of Rebecca. Although her absence may deprive her of a voice, conversely, it means that she both occupies the gaze and, crucially, evades the male gaze. In becoming invisible, she is de-objectified. The men both behind of and in front of the camera are unable to sexualize a woman who they cannot see. Through architecture, design, light, and shadows, the spaces of Rebecca illustrate female fear and desire. Hitchcock described Manderley as having no geographical space. It was separated, he told Truffaut. The unknowability of Manderley, then, and its disorientating nature tie it inextricably to Rebecca herself, who also has no fixed geographical space. For we can feel her at Manderley, at the boathouse, and also she can be found at the bottom of the sea. Manderley, in fact, becomes symbolic of the past and the present, the invisible and the visible, as we see it both in its fully functioning state and as an empty shell. Here, architecture becomes metaphor, the living and the corpse distilled into one image. Rebecca's boathouse, a private and secluded getaway where she no doubt enjoyed many a wonderful rendezvous, is the most personal of spaces. and the one which, crucially, the second Mrs. De Winter is most powerfully drawn towards, discovering it for herself. Through the call of those waves, and with a little bit of help from dog Jasper, she experiences the pull of Rebecca, after being forbidden to explore any further by Maxim. Furthermore, it represents the first time that she defies her husband after so far being submissive up to this point in the film. The boathouse and Manderley are like the Bates Motel and Bates family home of Psycho are for Norman. They're representative of the private and the public sides of Rebecca, and both are steeped in her presence. Rebecca's name haunts the dream of the second Mrs. De Winter before she's left Monte Carlo for Manderley. It's a possession obsession that will continue to grow, resulting in internal feelings of attraction and fear, and external expressions of division and assimilation. As she dreams, echoes of Rebecca encircle her mind. She becomes breathless. She caresses herself. She connects to the erotic unconscious. And pointedly, after having only just met with Maxim, her future husband, it is the mystery woman who occupies her psyche in deep and unspoken ways. In fact, Rebecca opens with the new bride's famous line involving a dream. Last night, I dreamt we went to Manderley. Now, while these words are the first spoken in Rebecca, they are delivered after the events of the film, therefore connecting the young woman and us back to Rebecca through a desire to return to a place where she is powerfully felt. Well, Hitchcock communicates Rebecca's return by linking her continually to objects: handkerchiefs, blankets, stationery, napkins, pillows, as intimate tactile items that contain a charge. They connect the second Mrs. De Winter to Rebecca through the power of touch. By wiping away her tears and caressing her lap, they act as signposts for desire and fulfillment, most specifically through their associations to food and sex. However, by linking Rebecca to items of triviality repeatedly, this in turn also seeks to connect her to the inhuman and the fetishistic, to reduce her to inanimate objects that carry no greater overall meaning. Not long after arrival at Manderley, the second Mr. Winter is leafing through a fashion magazine entitled Beauty, the magazine for smart women, when she finds an aspirational figure of a woman in a sophisticated black dress with a flower corsage. Here, then, is the first of many examples of her viewing an image she wishes to mimic, which in turn is an unconscious echo of her continual mimicking of Rebecca. This moment encapsulates one of Rebecca's central interrogations, that of the image, its copy, and the fragile border that separates the two. And on the note of copying, in her courting scenes at Monte Carlo with Maxim, the yet-to-be Mrs. De Winter is displeased with a portrait that she sketched of him, remarking how, "It's the perspective, I can never get it right." By expressing this dissatisfaction with Maxim's likeness, it suggests then that the recreation of the male body has no interest for this young female artist. However, once at Manderley, we see her sketching multiple all-female identities, and this alone.
Sorry, Rebecca, I'm not sure we can hear you right
Of the
now.
female
Oh,
body.
there we are. Sorry. Could you just go back with it for last two sentences, just because the audio seemed to. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I say, and on the note of copying, in her courting scenes at Monte Carlo with Maxim, the yet-to-be Mrs. De Winter is displeased with the portrait that she sketched of him, remarking how, "It's the perspective, I can never get it right. By expressing this dissatisfaction with Maxim's likeness, then, what this suggests is that the recreation of the male body has no interest for this young female artist. However, once at Manderley, we see her sketching multiple all-female identities, and this, along with the all-female portraits that adorn the corridors of Manderley and the many playful costumes featured in the film, all converge to signify the return of the female body, a return unquestionably to Rebecca. At a pivotal point in the film, the second Mrs. De Winter assumes the leading role in Mrs. Danvers's recreation of a scene from the past. The setting for this restaging is the West Wing, a space that is soft and sensual with flaps and folds galore. Vaginal much? It's no coincidence that in this act of reproduction, the new bride is sat before a mirror. What this depicts is a moment of multiplicity, where the boundaries of identity have faded away. In submitting to this role play, the new Mrs. De Winter now occupies a liminal space, existing somewhere between herself and her predecessor, between the living and the dead. It is after visiting this hyper-feminine and hyper-sexual space of the West Wing that the second Mrs. De Winter becomes emboldened, immediately afterwards ordering Mrs. Danvers to get rid of Rebecca's things, rising up to announce, "I'm Mrs. De Winter now," a statement that seeks to break away from, but which of course also continues to bind her inextricably to Rebecca. In a bid to take possession of this new status and initiate a rebirth, the new Mrs. De Winter proposes a costume ball, which will, she says, remind people that Manderley is the same as it ever was. Here we have, in the midst of an attempt at an intentional change, another return moment, back into the past, back to Rebecca. She sketches ideas for her outfit, and the costumes that she designs, but then discards, reveal a curiosity to try out and try on different identities. From the armoured figure proudly pointing a phallic sword to the sky, reflecting strength and power, to these lavish dresses with oversized skirts and frilled details, the female body becomes a point of attachment. It carries strong connections to creativity, autonomy, and of the second Mrs. De Winter's exploration of an alternate self. However, she's persuaded away from these sketches by Mrs. Danvers, who's now upped her game somewhat by facilitating the resurrection of not one, but two women of the past. The new bride is coaxed into attending the ball as Caroline De Winter, a relative from the family portrait gallery, who, through her silent power, joins the League of Absent Omnipresent Women. Most notably, the second Mrs. De Winter has shifted from her own sketches, which link to authorship and autonomy, to selecting the De Winter portrait, a relic of the past, composed by the hand of another artist. We learn that Rebecca herself made this costume choice for a previous ball. And through this repetition then, the second Mrs. De Winter conjures up not only Caroline, but more crucially, her predecessor, meaning that once again, Rebecca returns. But importantly, the act of dressing up as Caroline cum Rebecca before she joins the guests at the ball comes with a renewed sense of vigour and excitement for the new Mrs. De Winter, signs that I feel point to a deeply felt and positively affirming attraction towards Rebecca. Strangely, although Mrs. Danvers remarks how a new mistress could never come close to Rebecca, the second Mrs. De Winter seems to do quite an apt job at bringing her back from the dead. When she enters the party in full costume, Maxim's sister Beatrice whispers, "Rebecca," It is as though she's unable to separate the two. Despite this attempt to transcend Rebecca, the second Mrs. De Winter has never inhabited nor evoked her as accurately as she does now. After the ball, in a moment punctuated with fireworks, we discover, along with the second Mrs. De Winter, that Rebecca was murdered, her body drowned at sea. We also learn that Maxim purposely identifies the body of another woman in her place. This invalidates not only Rebecca's status and denies her a resting place, it also means that the body of a nameless woman shares the connection to the nameless heroine, joins Rebecca as another absent woman, and finally echoes the theme of female identities in the film becoming one. With his ex-wife now at the bottom of the sea, this leaves Maxim with full freedom to edit and control his version of what occurred between them. So far, he's assumed the truth will never be uncovered. Her body will never rise. She won't come back because she can't. Critically, Maxim's confession isn't voluntary, but forced upon him at the discovery of Rebecca's body. He remarks how Rebecca was so lovely, accomplished, and amusing, reducing her to the three things that really matter in a wife: breeding, brains, and beauty. In short, the male ideal of the perfect woman. However, he counters this with a declaration of how she was incapable of love or tenderness or decency, bemoaning how he should never have accepted her dirty bargain. Rebecca as woman, then, is associated with emotional emptiness and filth. He also likens her to the devil and uses the words ill and queer when describing her, words that seek to both blame and other her sexuality. Oh, she played the game brilliantly, he tells his young wife. In fact, she played it much better than he did. But cruelly, while he is rewarded with the freedom to enjoy a new life, Rebecca's is extinguished. Like Mrs. Bates of Psycho, we're told Rebecca smiled in death. Although Maxim tried to bury the evidence by watching her boat sink, something that echoes Norman watching the car containing Marion's body submerging into the swamp of Psycho, Rebecca has brought this to the surface through her resurrection. She opposed the confining roles of the feminine ideal by taunting Maxim that while she continued to do as she pleases in their marriage, she will also appear to be the perfect mother, as she has been the perfect wife, and nobody will know. But despite being dead, she's not quite done yet. Just at the moment when the new Mrs. De Winter declares Rebecca hasn't won, the piercing ring of a phone breaks through the faux relief. Maxim is called to identify his dead wife's body. Rebecca reasserts herself then and occupies the forefront of the narrative once again. So, what of that anarchic and heated ending? Now that the truth is out and there's no more secrets, should this pave the way for a happy conclusion? But of course, not all fairy tales end happily. In a masterstroke of ambiguity and subversion, Hitchcock chooses not to give the final shot to the couple, or even to the new bride, but to Rebecca, whose ubiquitous awe returns again. Provocative and taunting, sultry and deadly, it adorns the soft satin casing of a pillow. But it is, as Rebecca was, full of determination, demanding to be seen. The obliteration of the palatial mandolin, a symbol of patriarchal affluence, as it burns in flames, courtesy of Mrs. Danvers, proves that women can threaten and disrupt male structures that seek to repeatedly confine them. Consuming the frame, the R is evidence that Rebecca continues to live on and will continue to return. Rebecca has won, but at a cost. In Rebecca, Hitchcock always ensures we're aligned to the female experience, depicting events through the eyes of women, even when men like Maxim tell the story, as shown in the boathouse scene, where we instinctively place Rebecca before us, performing each action as it's described. It may be Maxim's words we're hearing, but we're firmly in Rebecca's perspective. On the other hand, with Maxim given the agency to reveal all this, there's also an argument for Hitchcock privileging a masculine point of view. As we see across his work, one of the director's preoccupations is the theme of identity, and Rebecca places the female front and centre. As he himself explained, I felt I had to treat it from the girl's point of view. In doing so, this encourages a recognition between not just female viewers, but all viewers, a choice and effect that destabilizes a male-centric narrative. On the other hand, we mustn't forget that we can neither deny nor confirm what we know of Rebecca from Rebecca herself. In the end, we can't overlook that Rebecca's subject to suffering and punishment, and her literal removal forces us to acknowledge that it puts the film in a complicated space of feminist questionability. Ahead of making the film, the director had not long arrived at Hollywood, of course, with his wife Alma, his daughter Patricia, and assistant and co-writer of the Rebecca screenplay, Joan Harrison. Therefore, I feel it's important and very relevant to say he was, in his life at this time, surrounded by female energy. Disappointingly, in his famous interviews with Truffaut, Hitchcock dismissed one of his most popular and enduring films, and most interestingly for our conversation around identity, chose not to identify it with his own name. Well, it's not a Hitchcock picture, it's a novel, really, he said. Why would he do such a thing? There's many possibilities, but I wonder whether it represents a denial of a mirror moment that the film may afford us of a director whose personal life, despite decades in the film industry, remained largely enigmatic. Is there something present within the film, indeed within Rebecca herself, in its exploration of borders and boundaries, identity and sexuality, that may reveal something deep within Hitch that he may or may not have been conscious of? Hitchcock's continual undermining and subverting of fixed identity through his leading and yet invisible character of Rebecca invites us, his audience, to ask questions about our own sense of self too. The ideas that are played out in the film as they relate to division and individuality also reflect society's obsession with placing women in competition with one another, and how women are often categorized as one rather than singularly unique, discouraged from their own individual expression. Rebecca is an anarchic, disruptive force to Maxim, to his status, his possessions, his image, and his future. She is, as Madleski summarizes, a feminist hero, someone who defies the patriarchal order. She represents a threatening female force. And I mean threatening in the most magnificent of ways. And so we are now going to move on to the second case study after a quick slip of water, which is Vertigo. Okay, so as we arrive at 1958's Vertigo, Hitchcock is presenting us here with a haunting and yet highly complex treatment that echoes the very themes contained within the film itself, of art, of over-identification, of resurrection, and once again, the female image. In Vertigo, the absent woman is what I call a cluster of multiplicity. Firstly, she's a real woman, Madeline, cruelly murdered by her husband, Gavin Elster. Secondly, she becomes a reconstruction performed by Judy Barton. Thirdly, she is then resituated into the film as an imitation of Madeline under Scotty Ferguson's direction, evolving then into a copy of a copy. And finally, she reflects Scotty himself. Set in San Francisco, Vertigo focuses on retired detective Scotty, who's hired by an old acquaintance, Gavin Elster, to follow his wife, Madeline, who he believes is being haunted by her great-grandmother, Carlotta Valdez. The mystery is not quite as straightforward as it may seem when it transpires that the Madeline whom Scotty is trailing is in fact an imitation of Elster's wife, embodied by Judy, forming part of an elaborate murder plot. So, with barely any screen time, we see her on just one occasion, right before her death. The real Madeline is the wife of Vertigo's ringmaster, Gavin Elster, who murders her, throwing her from a bell tower. She becomes then nothing more than a corpse. We never hear her speak, we have no knowledge of who she is, or of her relationship with her husband. When Elster approaches Scotty to follow his wife, he reinvents Madeline, creating an elaborate backstory, all the while knowing of his murder plot. Priming Scotty for the events that follow, Elster confesses that he's spoken to doctors carefully about Madeline, falling into then the demeaning archetype of the female who is ill or out of her mind and in need of a cure. It's one of the film's deep ironies that it is in fact Scotty who would most benefit from medical attention, and indeed at the midpoint of the film we see him hospitalised. But we also learn from Elster that Madeline is the great-granddaughter of Carlotta Valdez, another absent female figure from the past who haunts the film. To add to this, the real Madeline's absence across Vertigo is mirrored by the fact that Jean Corbett, the actress who portrays her, is not given a credit for her role. She too then, like the part she plays, remains unacknowledged. The females of Vertigo, however, share a connection that transcends mortal boundaries as they merge into one another. Embodied by Judy Barton, a department store assistant from Kansas, whose path has intertwined with Gavin Elster, the constructed Madeline is the result of hours of coaching, of being made over to bring the original Madeline back to life. However, as Madeline, she becomes Scotty's attachment through his eroticization of the female body, and in casting her as the woman who must be rescued. The beautiful, mysterious female must not only be saved and protected, it's assumed that as a woman she can't protect herself, but also investigated and stalked. She's therefore turned into a fetishized object of obsession. Although a reanimation of Madeline, Judy's circumstances are strikingly familiar. His silence in playing the role of Madeline, for she doesn't speak until 45 minutes into the film, are an echo of the eternal silencing of the real Madeline. This is contrasted with the Judy that we meet in the second part of the film, a woman who's straight talking and, at least on first instance, not afraid to speak her mind. But posing a threat to male power, the outspoken woman finds herself silenced again into a new Madeline, transitioning then from playing the dead woman to playing the role of herself playing a dead woman. And in doing so, she becomes even more of a ghost than Madeline herself. Hitchcock uses space, spirals, archways, passages to communicate Madeline's presence. Cavernous and dark, they are symbolic of the vaginal, destabilizing Scotty, reminding him of his own death wish. They illustrate his over-identification with a woman who's not only dead, but who never existed to begin with. To Scotty, these architectural structures are Madeline. She lives and breathes through these monuments of the past, coming back, returning Through landmarks, she forms part of the architectural landscape, a memento mori, a piece of history that can never be erased. But this is countered by the fact that these buildings are most likely designed and made by men. Another echo of construction, then, within the film. Women's presence within these landmarks then acts as a metaphorical claim for a space that has been denied. Mysterious and enveloping, Madeline is the San Francisco fog. Alluring and melancholic, she is Bernard Herrmann's deeply poetic score, lost in repeated cycles of romance and death. She is an image, an aesthetic. For notice that when Scotty tries to recreate Madeline upon meeting Judy, he never asks her to behave as Madeline would do. Instead, everything is fixated on the visual. Scotty's idealization is defined outwardly rather than inwardly. This femininity in our culture is described by Madlesky as largely a male construct, a male design. And this femininity is, in fact, a matter of external trappings, of roles and masquerades without essence. Madeline's objectification becomes symbolic of how woman is perceived primarily through an aesthetic lens rather than an intellectual one. The widespread aura of Madeline across Vertigo, whether it be through costume, flowers, architecture, or score, is a signifier of the power and the prevalence of woman in the film. However, we must also stop to recall that it is not the real Madeline who is being felt and experienced. It is first Elster's version and then Scotty's, denying Madeline a full and a true identity. Furthermore, while this serves to alienate the real and the performed Madeline from one another, we may also conclude that through being enforced as the tool of imitation, Judy is also denied an identity. In fact, she's stripped of hers not once, but twice, which in turn aligns her with a deceased female counterpart. When we finally meet Judy, her forthrightness feels like a breath of fresh air after the quiet meekness of Madeline. However, the silencing of the real Madeline is mirrored in Judy being held silent by Elster, unable to fully confess her feelings or her identity to Scotty. Immersed so deeply in Madeline's inner landscape, Judy fills up her absence by imitating her presence. As Robin Wood has observed, she's not merely acting, but becoming Madeline. In a convergence of identity and performance, it is at times hard to detect where Madeline ends and Judy begins, and whether imitation has in fact developed into possession. We know that Scotty over-identifies with Madeline, but is it possible that Judy also finds herself slipping into this liminal space between that which is real and that which is illusory? After serving her part in Elster's plan, by keeping the grey suit, her leading costume in the role, Judy evidences that she is unable to fully let go. Instead, she chooses to keep part of the past alive. Upon taking the suit from her wardrobe, she clings to it, pressing it close to her chest. But why, to use Scotty's later turn of phrase, has she become so sentimental? This much overlooked detail suggests to me more than just a connection to Scotty. It denotes an attachment to Madeline, a struggle to, as she will later write in her letter to Scotty, forget the other and forget the past. As available Ferguson, a word that he chooses to describe himself, Scotty takes on the job of following Madeline. However, undoubtedly, the real subject of Scotty's investigation is himself. His obsession with the female image is what Sarah Kaufman has described as men's fascination with the eternal feminine. It's nothing but a fascination with their own double and the feeling of uncanniness. The feeling of seeing a ghost or double is an abrupt reappearance of what is lost or overcome. The first time that Scotty sees Madeline is from behind. She's faceless, without an identity, a perfect woman onto who he can project a male fantasy. Scotty may be following what looks to be a real living Madeline, but what is visible is also not in fact present, for she is not really Madeline, and his attraction is rooted in over-identification rather than reality. During Scotty's lengthy scenes following her around San Francisco, he sees Madeline posing in heightened romantic locations associated with art, history, and death. These places are loaded with emotion and meaning. They're designed to steer and direct Scotty. Scotty's vision of a Madeline is a woman who is romantic, lost, untouchable, and connected to death. A vision that is so attractive to him because it's a reflection of himself. Fully believing he's enjoying what is arguably the greatest male kink of all time, watching a woman without her knowledge. Scotty's distance from and obsession with Madeline awakens an identification in him. He connects to her story through a fetishization of self-annihilation. In a nod to the uncanny, Scotty's pursuit of Madeline takes him to somewhere familiar. In fact, one incident of his stalking of her leads him literally back to his own home. Madeline then returns Scotty to himself. An unknowable and an enigmatic female force, Scotty's drawn to Madeline because, through her non-existence, she's a reflection of his own death drive, as we see in the dream sequence when he becomes Madeline by falling from the bell tower. Seeking the object of his investigation confirms Scotty's identity for him, but it comes with a flip side when he realises that what he's fallen in love with is a counterfeit image. As Gary M. Leonard so succinctly puts it, for Scotty, the discovery that Madeline does not exist can be nothing less than the discovery that he does not exist either. The lack of autonomy granted to the real Madeline is certainly damning from a feminist perspective. But might Hitchcock be reflecting women's overlooked position in society rather than endorsing it? Hitchcock's choices when it comes to perspective in Vertigo make it, I feel, one of the richest of his films to analyse. Throughout, we're placed in Scotty's eyes. Hitchcock is encouraging us to fall in with his male lead. However, when this is subverted, we find ourselves unexpectedly and quite wonderfully, I feel, in Judy's shoes. Despite this radical switch in perspective, it's the men who tell many of the stories of Vertigo, with local historian Pop Liebel filling in Carlotta's background, describing her as the mad Carlotta. Again, a word very suited to Scotty. Working in a bookshop surrounded by words rather than people, he therefore qualifies as a master storyteller. As with Rebecca, and as we will see in Psycho 2, there's no way of validating these accounts. Elster's, in fact, is wrapped in deceit and is, like Madeline, part construction, rewritten to serve his own desires. Throughout Vertigo, Judy remains a disposable victim in service of male power and freedom, words repeated throughout the film, whether it be in Scotty's quest in acquiring knowledge about himself or in the financial gain of Elster. In the end, Judy becomes more like the real Madeline than she would ever have wished for. But Hitchcock cuts through this male perspective in the inclusion of Judy's flashback moment. Finally, then, a woman tells her story. The reveal is staged as a highly intimate moment. We hear directly and privately from Judy, an experience that is never replicated with Scotty. She breaks the fourth wall, fixing her eyes on ours with a look loaded with emotion. It's also very aptly a gaze back into the past. We're given just a few uncanny seconds of the real and the faux Madeline on screen together. The former is lifeless in Elster's arms, while Judy emerges from a trapdoor just in time to see her doppelganger fall. Before long, she's physically restricted, held tightly by Elster, whose hand covers her mouth. So far, a vital part of the plan. She's left to watch both Madeline and her future fate, hurtling toward a silent nothingness. Undermining, then, any whole identification with Scotty, who will now evolve from victim to violator, Hitchcock creates a strong female moment where Judy's confession not only involves the audience, but it has a significant impact on how we process and experience the remainder of the film. By ripping up her confession letter to Scotty, Judy makes a final surrender to the past, to Madeline. Shortly after, she sat on her bed in the shadows, a silhouette. She has become a void, an abyss that can only signify both a literal and a metaphorical death. After a reenactment of their makeover with Elster, this time with Scotty directing and even correcting her physical appearance, returning to the Empire Hotel, Judy is sent to the bathroom, a place of continued interest in Hitchcock's work, specifically in regards to women and connotations around cleanliness, decency, and dirt, and certainly of our next case study, Psycho. When she emerges, the figure we see is Judy, Madeline, and at the same time, a ghost. Scotty may have successfully recreated the ideal female image, but now more ghostly than the Madeline of the first half of the film. It is one that is empty, vacant, transparent. Unable to stop himself from recreating the past, Scotty returns to the scene of the crime, the place where Judy witnessed Madeline's body being thrown from the bell tower. Judy and Madeline's paths are no longer separate or parallel. Their fates are inevitably entwined, doomed to eternal oblivion. Steeped in history and in being part of the real Madeline's past, this return to the bell tower points towards a tragic end that's been chasing Judy and has now come to meet her in the present. After being tormented and assaulted by Scotty, he becomes in these final moments a mimic of the film's ultimate villain, Elster. Judy falls to her death as a nun appears, as though from out of a dream and into the real world, causing alarm and confusion. Arriving as Judy dies, a transference takes place between the women, of one eroticized archetypal construction of a female image being replaced by another. The nun represents both Judy's present condition of confinement, discipline, and adherence, but her true fate is bound up with Madeline, and her death, an echo of Madeline's own, is the film's final repetition. Madeline, for Judy, is the past, and a past that keeps reappearing at the hands of male entitlement that she cannot escape. Scotty may be considered the protagonist of Vertigo, but Scotty will always be filled up and consumed and belong to Madeline. Although woman has the power to transcend and return, to do this, she must also suffer. And Madeline and Judy's death communicate a sense of inevitable female destruction. Only Midge, who I haven't had a chance to spend any time on, manages to get away, but with nothing but grief and sadness on her horizon. The woman then who haunts Vertigo is an idealization built around beauty, mystique, the unobtainable, and ultimately that which is non-existent. The close-up of a woman's face that opens the film and fills the screen captures our attention through its eroticism and its feminine power. But perhaps when we revisit the image after the final scene, we may find it represents the absence of woman, of Madeline, of Carlotta, of Judy. She may fill the screen, but she has no identity. She is made into an object of desire, an image to be resurrected time and time again in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. And so now we move from San Francisco to the Bates Motel in the final case study, Psycho. Okay. So Psycho is often considered to be a story of two parts, belonging to the highly relatable and most unfortunate Marion Crane, and to Norma Bates, who is undoubtedly one of the most brilliant and most complex of the Hitchcock males. However, there is another story waiting to be told, I feel, that of the mothered Norma Bates. Despite her lifelessness, the absent woman of Psycho remains, of course, ever present in bodily form. Her corpse is like Rebecca's, buried, hidden away in the depths of the fruit cellar. It's also like Vertigo's Madeline, filling window frames, watching out over everything and everyone from her bird's eye view. Psycho is ostensibly the story of Marion Crane, a woman who steals $40,000 and goes on the run. However, it evolves into an exploration of the character of Norman Bates, and most notably, his ambiguous relationship with his mother. It's easy to get swept away with Norman, and believe me, I do. But what might we unearth if, like Modleski, we seek to defend that much maligned woman, Mrs. Bates? After a love affair following the death of Norman's father, a choice that evidences female sexual desire and eroticism, and is of particular interest given that Norman performs here as prudish, Norma is fatally poisoned. In life, then, Norma was open, free, expressive with her body. This then ties her to Marion Crane, the film's initial protagonist, who we first see post-coital after a lunchtime rendezvous. Norma's presented as a domineering force who suffocated her son. Deemed clinging and demanding, she's painted as mad, ill, jealous. Signposts again to these problematic and reductive female archetypes. Although dead, her corpse is maintained by Norman, a skilled taxidermist. The notion of stuffing his mother then also comes with connotations of silencing. The treatment and handling of the corpse, where consent is not an option, is also a violation against Norma's body, a deprivation of liberty and respect. Preserved as a memorial of the past, she is utterly objectified. All that is left of her is a shell. With her mind no longer present, our understanding of her interior is shaped wholly through Norman. Through the shared misidentification of the Hitchcockian female body, we can trace a line all the way back from 1960 to 1940, linking Rebecca, Madeline, and Norma together through male attempts to either consume their identity or make them disappear altogether. Defined solely as a mother figure, this is a dilution that seeks to characterize Norma primarily through her attachment to another. Often referred to as the quintessential monstrous mother, overbearing and consumptive. What if Norma is a subversion of the traditional maternal female? What if, by connecting her with destruction over nurturing, it signifies a rebellion against woman's proper place, a rejection of the roles imposed upon her. In Psycho, the absent female stretches out beyond one figure to include Marion and her mother, who form a reflection of Norma and Norman in their mother-child relationship. Despite her protagonist status in the first portion of the film, after her death, I argue that Marion Crane also becomes an invisible woman of the narrative too. Marion, who has driven this narrative and been incredibly visible, of course, becomes absent after her death. And Norma, who we knew so little of, now becomes our central focus of female curiosity. Both women find themselves being underestimated by men, but they prove this couldn't be further from the truth. Looked upon as a mere office girl, Marion manages to con her boss and the lecherous Cassidy. Her escape is from a masculine-dominated world, from a workplace steeped in misogyny and inappropriate boundary crossing, to being followed by what I think is one of cinema's most intimidating policemen, and finally, an encounter with a suspicious car salesman. Adding further weight to this reading, we also hear Norman later remark how he is not capable of being fooled by a woman. A fragile assertion indeed. Over the course of her journey, Marion is consistently met by figures of masculine authority. When stopped by the police, she's asked to show her license to prove her identity. She must then repeat this process with California Charlie at the car dealership, where she's asked to prove the car is hers. This necessity for women to prove who they are ties Marion to Judy Barton, who shows Scotty her driving license to prove she isn't Madeline. As a figure devoid of life, the Hitchcock woman proves herself to be nothing if not resourceful in these studies. With so much against her, she must become innovative in her return. Like her predecessors, Rebecca and Madeline, Marion is no exception in her creative methods of coming back. Whether it be through the notepaper, which she subtracted $40,000 from, found in the toilet, or the car that is pulled from a swamp in the film's closing moment. Although Mrs. Bates looms over Psycho as a figure of fear, her narrative is taken away from her by other, most significantly male characters. We listen first to Norman recounting his experience. She had to raise me all by herself after my father died, he says. Mother met this man and he talked her into buying this motel. And when he died too, it was just too great a shock for her. And the way he died. Anyway, it was just too great a loss for her. She had nothing left. Now, while Norman remains charming, engaging, and evokes a constant curiosity in us, we should also listen mindfully to Barbara Creed's instruction that, in deciding the true nature of Norman's mother, all we have to go on is Norman's representation of her. Later, when Lila reports her sister missing to the local sheriff, another version of events is presented about the bad business 10 years ago. Sheriff Chambers explains how Norman Bates's mother has been dead and buried for the past 10 years. Mrs. Bates poisoned this guy she was involved with when she found out he was married, then took a helping of the same thing herself. Of course, the third and final and probably most famous summary of Norma's history comes from the psychiatrist, another male, post Norman's arrest. But interestingly here, he informs the room that I got the whole story, but not from Norman. I got it from his mother. These accounts are all highly contrasting in their detail, and as such, their validity must be questioned. Even more critically, none of these words are spoken by Norma herself, meaning that ultimately her story is one told repeatedly by men. Norma's presence is felt in the stylistic and technical choices made by Hitchcock and his team. The strings of Bernard Herrmann's shrieking score evoke an expression in place of a voice lost. And elsewhere, she's sensed in the camera work, the lighting, and the play with space and absence within the frame. Despite not being present, she is felt in the swooping birds that lurk over Norman in the parlour, in the quiet and yet threatening stillness of the swamp, and most notably of all, in her bedroom cum shrine. Hitchcock uses the motif of water to communicate female power too, but it is power that is soon negated. Marion's arrival at the Bates Motel amid sheets of rain reflects the second Mrs. De Winter's arrival at Manderley. Both are displays of female sexuality, of an unstoppable, porous nature. After her murder, the water in Marion's shower continues to run, as though she's trying to communicate, fighting to take up space. In his clean-up job, Norman uses water as a cleanser, a purifier, as a way of gaining back the facade of respectability that insinuates a link between the female body and uncleanliness. Through this operation, all traces of Marion are eradicated. She is wiped out, removed, as though she never existed. She becomes forever absent. Time and time again, we see that the allure of Norma from beyond the grave remains impossible to resist. Both Detective Arbogast, hired by Marion's employers, and Marion's sister, Lila, experience a pull towards the Bates home with the primary aim of seeking Norma out. But only one of them finds the real Norma Bates. As though in some kind of telepathic dialogue together, while the males of the film, Arbogast, Sam, Sheriff Chambers, remain ineffective in finding Norma, the only female, Lila, succeeds. Norma's presence echoes within the walls of the motel and the family home, but it is, of course, in the bedroom of the latter that she manifests most strongly of all. Steeped in the past and its former inhabitant, like Rebecca's West Wing, the room is cluttered with objects, ornaments, needlework. Curiously, a portrait hangs over the bed. There are nude statues. The closet is full, and there's a human imprint on the mattress. This is a museum of the past that contains more sense of an identity than any other space of the film. It's an indication that we are edging ever closer to the discovery of Norma. The big reveal of Psycho, of course, is that it is not Norma, but Norman who is committing the murders of the film, placing him in the unique dual role of protagonist-antagonist. However, it's hard not to empathise with the internalising and vulnerable Norman and his situation, one built on a complex traumatic psychological history pertaining to the mother-child relationship. In Rebecca, the second Mrs. De Winter continues to evoke her predecessor through costume. In Vertigo, Judy is made over by Elster and Scotty. In Psycho, Norman himself and Norman alone resurrects Norma intentionally. It's a manifestation of his obsession with the past, and one that is connected, like Scotty, with an over-identification of a female figure, mirroring a possessiveness associated with a childhood he wishes to correct, as Barbara Creed notes in her chapter on Mrs. Bates in The Monstrous Feminine. Norman's desire to become his mother is motivated not by love, but by fear. He wants to castrate rather than be castrated. He constructs then an alternate reality, both based on a past steeped in notions of guilt, abandonment, and repeated trauma, and as his mother no longer exists, a present that is entirely illusory. When Norman kills, he is embodying his mother, the other, a status that he clearly identifies with, but in performance finds deeply traumatic. When the murders take place, Hitchcock somehow manages to make us forget that it is Norman behind the knife. This all too easy slippage into reading the murderer as mother is a connective fabric to the notion of the female cast as villain, as responsible, as the one to blame. The son's embodiment of his mother represents a division within himself. This is shown through the mother voice, which proves to be oppositional and ambiguously forceful through a consistent questioning. Norman's Norma is a woman he wants to defy, a woman who needs him, and a woman who he deems is his best friend. This assimilation is a repurposing of a relationship to fit some complex needs and desires through a wish to both shake her off and reanimate her. Lila's discovery of Norma's corpse links back to Marion, and through finding Norma, this leads to the recovery of her sister's body in the swamp. A pivotal moment then. This undermines the brutal and seemingly impenetrable male power structure of Psycho's world. It is an example of what Madlesky describes as a femininity that subverts claims to mastery and authority, not only of the male characters, but the director himself. In this climax, scored by Vera Miles's unforgettable scream, all three women of the film are connected, each a part of the other's story. Together, Norma, Lila, and Marion have, if only for a moment, broken through what Creed describes as the phallocentric culture. After Hitchcock's biggest build-up to his female character, we finally come face to face. Our projections and assumptions are disproved, however, when we realise she's not a murderous mother figure, but in fact a corpse. As the skull swings into view, she's not wimpish nor frail, but strong, determined, and most memorably of all, wearing a permanent, tauntingly wide smile, one that will fix the audience's gaze in the denouement as a resplendent abhorrence of femininity. Our experience of encountering the real Norma, even when dead, is far more affecting than her son's imitation. Indeed, nothing could have prepared us for this. Now visible, her presence is dramatic. She has our whole attention. In a feat that should be impossible, the empty, lifeless eye sockets occupy the gaze as an all-seeing and therefore all-knowing female figure. Regrettably, for the absent, omnipresent woman, interpretations of Norma are really composed through any kind of compassionate or broad-minded lens. As Madlesky reminds us, the crime is most unbearable, not to the son who committed it, but to the one who suffers its consequences. Madlesky notes how this is a moment of power for Norma, who, rather than defend or protect Norman, speaks through her son's body, chooses to protest her innocence and place the blame for crimes against women on her son. Typically read as a final twist of the knife on behalf of a murderous, manipulative mother, what if instead this is a moment of justice for Norma, one in which she finally has a voice that facilitates a reclaiming of her narrative? Through masquerading as his mother, Norman has deprived her of an identity thus far. However, through this monstrously beautiful display, Hitchcock employs an identity inversion. Now, Norman must surrender himself fully to the returning woman. As the psychiatrist explains, Norma Bates no longer exists. The swamp from which Marion's car is pulled in the closing shot represents a final female return. While the females of his films are forced to endure suffering, mistreatment, and cancelling out their identities, Hitchcock shows us that they also continue to rise. Although the end of Vertigo for Madeline and Judy is depressingly nihilistic, fire and water fail to erase Rebecca, And likewise, poisoning, stitching, stuffing, and attempts at concealment fail to keep Norma emerging from swamps, from cellars, and from her untimely grave. Through their absence, the Hitchcock women of this study then occupy a cinematic blind spot, but in being such a memorable part of our experience and in having such a lasting impact on the characters of the films, does being absent give these women as much power as it may seem to remove? For Hitchcock, the notion of boundaries, of the self and of place, most notably the disturbance of them, and the fixation with and reproduction of the image are ongoing preoccupations. The second Mrs. De Winter, Scotty Ferguson, and Norma Bates develop an over identification with their absent females, Rebecca, Madeline, and Norma. And as a result, all three of these films are studies of an obsession with the past. As Professor Tanya Midleski, author of The Women Who Knew Too Much, a book which changed my life, and I say that with no hyperbole, has remarked, the dead woman wields this new power in acts of psychic possession, thereby avenging her losses on the patriarchy. By placing the absent women at the centre of our focus, rather than keeping them on the borders, this opens up the possibility for a deeper and richer interrogation. Regrettably, we're unable to hear these stories from the females of the films firsthand. However, they're pretty good at being heard and noticed, whether it be through the burning down of palatial homes, through provoking internal examinations of masculinity, or in challenging motherhood. The woman of Hitchcock who is absent but omnipresent haunts the screen like no other. She is a body that rises, a woman who won't stay dead. She is the threat of female return. And that brings me to the end of my talk. I've included some links there to my podcast and socials. Please do check those out, get in touch. I'd love to hear from anybody, any thoughts. And thank you for listening. And of course, big thank you to Final Girls for having me.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Yeah, I really enjoyed your dissection of Norma Bates, especially now at the end. So now's the time for questions. If people want to write them down in the chat or turn their video on and ask away, please do. We don't have that much time, but enough time for a few questions for sure. I can maybe start things off. Yeah, you kind of mentioned this in the conclusion, but I'm just more curious in general about your choice to focus on the absent women and in context of Hitchcock. And I'm wondering about that choice, like why you wanted to talk about that. And also, like, is it kind of a critique or of Hitchcock's gender politics in general, like doing that? So I'm curious about that.
I would call it an exploration. Like for me, it's like my major fascination with Hitchcock is its contradiction in that it always seems to be one thing and another simultaneously. And I just always felt with these films there was a fascinating through line in how, yes, there's these central characters that we are in the eyes of, in the perspective of, and he goes to great pains to do that. But at the same time, there is also this very arguably even more powerful female absence that's there and what that can communicate and how I felt myself connected to that as well. And I just wanted to use that the time I had through this study to dig into that and to have a look at, you know, Hitchcock to me feels like someone who is very interested in like the visible and the invisible. And so, yeah, I just felt that these three women also deserved, you know, we talk so much about Scotty, we talk a lot about Norman, you know, they're fabulous characters, but I really kind of wanted to retcon that, be a bit rebellious.
Great. Yeah, if people want to turn on the video and maybe raise their hand if they do have a question, that way I can call on them. People are really loving in the comments here, they're loving you. Allie Pitts has a question. Do you want to take it away?
Hello. Yes, can you all hear me?
Yes. Hello, Ali.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for a fascinating talk. So, my question, I'm still kind of trying to form it in my head. So, it's around the fact that we have Norma and Norman, and it's really typical, particularly in the past, like mid 20th century, for sons to be named after fathers, to be just like John Jr. or whatever, or. What do you make of the fact that Norman is relatively unusual in taking the name, or the masculine version of his mother's name? Is there anything in that for you?
Oh, I'm sure there is. And names in Hitchcock are a point of fascination for me as well. I mean, across Vertigo, there's like Scotty, Scott, Ferguson. Hitchcock's very fascinated with names. Yeah, I'm sure it's this connective fabric between the two of them. Obviously, there's an absence of the father, which is really interesting. I think there's a lot to dig into in respect of the mother-son relationships across the Hitchcock canon as well. Like, and that's something that I think warrants uh a lot of study and thought. But yeah, I think, myself, it's like sometimes I talk about Norma and Norman and I get mixed up and I'm like, oh gosh, like what does it mean? I'm sure it's a conscious thing, and I think I like the fact that you've brought that to the forefront, because to me it kind of it speaks to the kind of boundaries of identity that I was like looking at through this study as well, and just how Hitchcock is even more kind of not corrupt in those boundaries, but they're so finite that it even goes as far as like the names. And it maybe as well, what it does is it kind of it what it's saying is actually the power in this film, if it doesn't rest with women, it's certainly kind of re being reclaimed by women all the time.
Mm. Uh, and it sort of creates a liminality between the two people as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and indeed between masculinity and femininity and whatever.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Super. Thank you very much for that great answer. I realize totally putting you on the spot with that one.
No, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? If not, I'd like to kind of zoom out. Oh, Jen, do you have a question? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Jen.
Hi there. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk today. It was just so fascinating and such a unique angle too. My question for you, a little more personal. Um, Out of sort of all of the Hitchcock female characters that sort of, in essence, as you said, have their voice sort of taken away in a sense throughout the story. Their Psycho. I think you'd also mentioned before Vertigo and Rebecca. Which character, just on a very personal level, did fascinated you the most when you began your thesis on this?
Oh, I thought you were going to say like in the whole of Hitchcock. I
Mm.
was ready to say Joe McKenna is such a fascinating example of this in The Man Who Knew Too Much. Like fascinating example, because literally she's a singer and she has to step down from her profession in support of her husband who's a doctor, and she kind of loses
Yeah.
her voice, and that whole film is about her refinding her voice. Such a brilliant example. But within this study, most definitely, it would be the second Mrs. De Winter in Rebecca, someone who I really connect with. She has that kind of, she just has that awkwardness about her that like I connect with on that level of going into that world. Um, and I think being able to dig into Rebecca and look at her and just to be able to reorientate my focus through these studies, which is something I've wanted to do for such a long time with these films. I mean, Norma as well. It's just a delight to actually be like, hey, let's, I'm not saying, I don't find Norman empathetic. I think Norman's an incredible character, but let's have a look somewhere else and see what we can find. Um, but then Madeline, I mean, utterly fascinating to think about how Madeline particularly enjoyed looking at how she echoes Scotty's own kind of internal broodings and how he connects with her and how, the absence within himself, it essentially the absence of Madeline is a mirror of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're alluding to this project, maybe this being part of a bigger project. Could you maybe talk about that a bit? I mean, if you're allowed to. Yeah.
I mean, this is something that fascinates me. It's not something that I've read of before, so it's an interrogation that I'm really keen to do. And the fact that I've kind of set it out in this initial study of just 3 films, it was hard to pick just 3. And then hard to just focus in for like the time I've got to talk. There was much more I wanted to say that I didn't get to say. So I certainly think there's an appetite for this. Um, and I think the fact that I'm finding things to me is enough to encourage me to carry on. So, so yes, I'm sure there'll be a bigger project that comes from this study.
Okay. So like in book form, or you just don't know yet, or
It would most definitely be a book form, yeah. Yeah.
okay. Okay,
With
nice.
something that has no word count on it.
Nice. Okay, well, is there anyone else who might have a question? If not, please, yeah, get in touch with Rebecca you have all her contact info here. And it was a pleasure. I loved hearing all you had to say about Hitchcock. And up next is our talk on women-directed folk horror by Laura Cannon. That should be very exciting as well. So tune in. This is a whole day, 2 days full of just great talks like this. Thank you again, Rebecca. Thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, this is just the beginning. So, all right. Yes. Perfect. Okay, well, have a nice day, everyone. Bye.